Namaskar. Producing India from colonial economy to national space. On the eve of his departure for a tour of Southeast Asia in July 1927, Rabindranath Tagore addressed a group of nationalist activities and intellectuals assembled at Kolkata University. His speech, later published as a separate volume titled Greater India, began by charting the familiar lines of his opposition to what he had elsewhere called the manistic logic of the nation, propelled by the dust storm of modern history. Indian nationalists had succumbed to the global hunger for the central political feast of the age, namely the goal of a sovereign nation states, seduced, seduced by a statistic imaginary. They were in danger. Tagore warned of eclipsing the eternal grace of India Bharat that lay in the capacity to see all as a part of ourselves, its imminent universalism and its acceptance of sacrifice, its spiritual essence. Without an identification of our own personality, the realization of the inner truth of Bharat would remain in unattainable, undreamed world. Tagore had helped author the vision of autonomy that anchored Swa- Swadeshi visions of Bharat as an organically constituted nation, as both a space of refuge and a site of resistance to colonialism. In his post-Swadeshi anti-nationalist incarnation, he sought the inner truth of India in a literal imaginative greater India that was roughly congruent to a pan-Asian world. It was still possible to witness the real wealth of India, to experience the visible surplus of her cultural life based on centuries of accumulating interconnections in this far-off field across oceanic barriers built on an ethic of sacrifice rather than implication of suffering. The shared truth of this pan-Asian world enabled us to feel those who are distant and differ to be near and meaningful to us. Tagore urged a spatial and ideological realignment of dominant anti-colonial nationalism beyond the barrier of external geography, and the nation formed towards this organically interlinked pan-Asian world. In a remarkable passage, Tagore uncannily presages recent subalternist attempts to contain the multi-temporal and multi-scalar dynamic of capitalism and the transformations wrought by colonialism in the static, if admittedly hyper geopolitical category of Europe. He observed, if we follow the course of our modern political self-assertion, we touch foreign history at its starting point. In a fresh, feverish political urge, we had to imagine ourselves to be dream-mates, Mazzini's, Garibaldi's, and Washington's in our economic life. We were caught in the labyrinth of imaginary Bolshevism, syndicalism, and socialism. These marriages, like manifestations are not the natural outgrowths of Indian history, but are fantasies born of our recent misfortune and hunger. As the film of this dream cinema is being unrolled before our eyes, we see the track mark "Made in Europe" placed in the corners, betraying the address of the factory where the film originated, entranced by the phantasmagoria of a globally ascendant national dream cinema that was for Tagore in irreducibly European in origin and content. Indians, qua nationalists, would remain passive spectators and consumers of histories and products made in Europe. Tagore powerfully articulates here the predicament of societies and people who bore the ideological stigmata of being historical latecomers in an era that seemed for many colonized intellectuals as that of the mechanical reproduction of European colonial and capitalist domination. Tagore's turn of the century articulation of Swadeshi Samaj, an autonomous national society grounded in collective practices of sacrifice, had long morphed into a liberal humanist internationalism premised on an individual individualist and individualizing ethic, yet his address captures in a poetic register the long echo of Swadeshi, the intimacy between a political economic vision of autarky made in Bharat and a substantially autonomous cultural space, whether located in the bounded national community of Bharat or in a wide pan-Asian arena. His liberal internationalism shared with Swadeshi discourse and encompassing ethic of indigen, indigeneity and self-conscious pursuit of forms of sociality and personhood untouched by the perceived abstract logic of capitalism and exempt from the geographies of domination that constituted colonial worlds. What held together these apparently distinct formations beyond their common intellectual genealogy were their roots within the problem of colonial unevenness, the shared grappling with the mundane and spectacular differentiations brought by the productions of the distinctive colonial state space, the attempt to secure an autonomous space-time once not burdened to what Tagore identified as the mirage of Europe resonates with many of the normative and conceptual impulses that have informed more recent claims of an alternate modernity and radical singularity animated by a shared utopian longing. Such formulations also contain a certain wild forgetting of their own conditions of possibility for what makes possible both projects of radical not autonomy and teleological accounts of the implication of social and cultural forms in the historically specific dialectic between universalizing the drive of capitalism and the multi-form of unevenness that are its internal supplement. Although capitalist modernity might have the determinate appearance like a mirage of constituting an empty homogeneous time and an abstract homogeneous space, it also contains within itself the principle of its own negation in the form of internal differentiation and fragmentation. The problematic of unevenness is a constitutive element of the doubled dynamic of capital and the phenomenological experience of modernity. Yet, as I have argued, the problem of unevenness in colonial India was shaped by features that set it apart, that rendered it distinctive. This was expressed in the particular relationship between colonial state space and the imperial economy, in the temporal accelerated articulation between noble and received forms and idioms, in the disconjecture between the space of the production of value and the space of its realization, and in the simultaneous homogenization and differentiation of economic relations on multiple spatial scales. As a lived reality, colonial state space was a multiply refracted force field. Its effects were manifest in the making of novel conceptions of space and time, in the radical signification of a range of local inflected socio-political categories: Aryavarta, Hindustan, Bharat, Swaraj, Swadeshi, Bharat Mata, in the forging of an insurgent nationalist political economy, and in the utopian charge of Swadeshi visions of autonomy, the colonial cartography of socio-economic and cultural differentiations animated popular attempts to estrange the colonial familiar and provisionized and the ground for nationalist appropriation for colonial state space and the locus of an imagined national space and economy. This may well be a David Harvey argue no outer resolution to the inner contradictions of capitalism, no stable institutional and spatial fix to the contradictions that have shaped its dynamic historical geography apart from India through going internal transformation. Yet, in a specific historical conjuncture and global field, the nation form came to represent for many and colonial activities in South Asia as elsewhere, the embodiment of a form of universality grounded in particularity of sustained economic growth and the institutional medium for either resolving or regulating socioeconomic unevenness. The author of the political economy of nation who elaborated the problem of unevenness and differentiation on multiple spatial scales and in different spheres. Dada Bhai Nervaji, among others, focused on the extractive relationship between Britain and India, commonly figured as that between bloated city and bleeding countryside, and identified the imperial skill-making project of a range of colonial policy. The celebrated train thesis, the foundational category of the economic critique of in colonialism, inverted the claim of material and moral progress generated by the colonial state and provided such positivist indices as national per capita income estimates in order to render palpable the impoverishment of what was seen as a bounded national space and economy. M. G. Ranade and later G. P. Joshi in Bowman Kale analyzed the generation of independent colonial economies in relation to the international division of labor that underwrote underwrote relations of unequal exchange in terms that contested and exceeded the axiomatic presuppositions of classical political economy. Others, such as Ramesh Dutt Radhakamal Mukherjee, directed attention to the depending internal differentiation of the imagined nation, evinced in the violent articulation of local and village economies with the world market, accelerated rural-urban polarization and massive rural migration, deepening class polarity, the refined separation between intellectual and manual labor, and the toll wrought by recurrent devastating famines in their attempt to envision a nationalist political economy against the abstractions of classical political economy and the contractions of colonial space. Indian nationalists assembled a strong autarky vision of the nation as the natural scale of capital accumulation and the collective embodiment of indigenous labor. If the project of Indian economics was a product of the lived contradictions of colonial space, it was also inseparably part of the transnational ascendancy of statist, statist developmentalist frameworks in the late 19th century. These represented a profound challenge to the political, economic, imaginary, and regulatory order that underwrote Britain's global spanning imperial economy. The promise of state-directed economic development conjured by the German historical school and list was explicitly intended for aspiring imperial powers. Civilized nations such as Germany and the United States suffering under the perceived dual yoke of classical political economy and Britain's global economic hegemony. Indian nationalists, especially Swadeshi activists, did more than simply extend the categories of listen, Listian, Lis- Listian developmentalism and the German historical school beyond the Atlantic circuit of its initial formulation by refracting and reworking the problem of political economic autonomy and development with a specific relation to colonial unevenness. They radicalized its political signification, depend its social difference, and transformed the original Listian developmentalism as recast in a range of colonial and peripheral contexts from the late 19th century India to 19th century Korea and Kemalist Turkey had a socially radical afterlife outside its original constituency precisely because of its articulation with distinctive forms of spatial unevenness and experiences of temporal non-synchronicities ethnicity. Ironically, an exploration of the insurgent national political economy forged by Indian nationalists returns to focus the now forgotten origins of the term post-colonial. The term was first used in the context of modes of articulation debates in South Asian political economy in the early 1970s. This is ironic in light of not only the decline of political economy in South Asian historiography and colonial studies more generally, but the predominant epistemological and discourse-centered preoccupations of the intermediary field designated as post-colonial theory. This is a point not just about the different political and conceptual vocations that categorize projects in distinct historical conjectures, but about the dangers of eclipsing from view the deeply impassioned politics of political, economic, and cultural autonomy fashioned by anti-colonial struggles. In our current historical movements, the spectral gathering of imperial projects, revisionists, apologias for empire, and the approximate after effects of neoliberal restructuring threatens to plug beyond the critical legacy of anti-colonial struggles. Indian nationalists, like many anti-colonial activists in East Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, had sought to realize the dream of political economy and a cultural autonomy to overcome what Gandhi called the Khudaro or colonialism, capitalism to achieve a subalternatively substantively multi-colonial future. We know all too well, of course, the disastering of this promise by both internal tensions and external constraints of the transformation of utopian regions into legitimating bunch of the hollowing out of the critical and radically futural impulse of the diverse anti-colonial projects, yet anti-colonial movements from the Athenian revolution of the 1790s that radicalized enlightenment frameworks, even though it was rendered unthinkable in its time to the 20th century era of Indian decolonization that fueled Bandung national developmentalism and the non-aligned movement that transposed Swadeshi's vision of autonomy onto a wider geopolitical field did secure the right of collective self-determination and economic autonomy, if only in a formal sense, beyond the particular regions of Europe and America. The temporary conjuncture between imperial projects and new liberal economic fatalism seems poised to render debates on post-coloniality, especially those that bracket political economy, even more scholastic. This point here is not to embrace any critical view of anti-colonial struggle. It is rather the importance of not confining our analysis to what Theodore Adorno identified as the historicity underpinnings of the loathsome question of what is living and what is dead, about past works and struggles of their message and meaning for the present. We might ask instead the anti-historicist question of what our shared global present signifies from the standpoint of anti-colonial struggle for autonomy. One of the aims of this work has been to demonstrate that a focus on the structural and experimental contradictions of colonialism does not mandate an as such, return to the crude determinations or tight teleologies of orthodox Marxism, nor does it entail glossing over the expressive negotiations, creative transpositions, and forms of social agency that challenged and fashioned apparently mutable structures of domination. It suggests that the values of a sustained focus on the regulated improvisations in both collective practices and conceptual frameworks are engendered within the inter, in- interst, interstices of contradictory social formations that affect durable transformation, so the formation and generalization of categories, national, economic, and national space within and again against colonial state space and innovation centered global economy attest to the reciprocal determination between contradictory structures and forms of agency, political economy, and cultural imaginary meaning and materiality. This book has sought to overcome the limits of methodological nationalism, which has enshrined categories such as national space and national economy as natural and has authorized the incarnation of multi-scalar and multi-temporal processes within state delineated territorial boundaries. By adopting a historical geographical perspective, it has elaborated the ini- inti it has elaborated the intimate relations between the production of an uneven colonial space, key global dynamics in the nationalization of everyday categories of understandings in a specific historical conjuncture. These processes operated on overlapping and intersecting spatial scales. They did not emerge outward from original or pre-given social relations and spaces, nor did they constitute simple linear blinks. Rather, their relation was that of a complex movement of accumulating interconnections within a specific global field. For all their apparent polysemy, they were closely entwined, rooted in and reflective of the production of a simultaneously interdependent, hierarchically organized and profoundly uneven global space. The constitutive element of Indian nationalism, the territorial native nativist envisaging of Bharat as an organic national whole, the tension between a universalistic conception of development and a particularistic vision of nationhood, the Swadesi born faith in a forging a uniquely basic path of industrialization that would yield capitalist development without gas gasless shaft without gasless shaft works gasless shaft gasless shaft gasless shaft were expressed and shaped through particular cultural and social logics and categories of understanding. Yet Indian nationalism was not a singular formation set apart from the global field of its emergence. The constitution, the attempt to secure an alternate gas stalled grounded in the perceived singularity of indigenous institutions and practices, was a historically specific response embedded within a particular global field. The idea of nationhood as the culmination of an inner dialectic, the expression of a singular organic formation, had become a key motif of late 19th and early 20th century nationalist discourse across diverse regional contexts. From confronted with the convulsive transformations wrought by colonialism and capitalism, many nationalists in colonial India as elsewhere interpreted and translated the historical dislocations of the present in and through a nativist, historicist, and idealist idioms. The territorial nativism was part of the global politics of territorial closure that defined the historical geographical field of the late 19th and early 20th century. Yet at the same time, the particular form of territorial nativism forged by an upper caste and ascendant Hindu middle class in the last third of the 19th century in colonial India had concretely local effects. It is only by exploring the historical production of the spatial and temporal matrices of nationalist imaginings that the internal relationship between nationalism and communalism became evident by providing a critical account of the formation of a territorial nativist episteme. This work has sought to suggest that neither nationalism nor communalism can be grasped in themselves, conceived independently of one another. Rather, they stood in a dialectical relationship to one another in the form of historically specific internal contraries as the inner lining of a territorial nativist visions of nationhood. Communalism are integral to the constitution of dominant ideologies and practices of Indian nationalism, even as it appeared to exceed their ideological origin. The Ideological symmetry between nationalism and colonialism was manifest in their common orientation towards the realization of the modern phantasm of sociocultural purity, the presumptive organic identity between individuals and larger collectivities, and the imagining of particular groups as the bearers of the stigma of otherness, belatedness, and insufficient authenticity. The discourse of colonialism and nationalism was never very far apart. They have a joint descent on in the territorial nativist conception of India as Bharat as elaborated between 1816 and 1880s. Territorial nativism conferred an ontological privilege to Hinduism as a unique universality and to upper caste Hinduism as the organic coordination uh, nation nationals. It did so not on explicitly religious grounds but through a historicist understanding of the liaisons between territory, history, and collective identity. It is impossible to understand the persistently secular self-understanding of dominant Indian nationalism, much less the way in which it figured the Muslim as a problematic particularity within an imagined national whole. Without reference to this historical and epistemological formation, the mobilizing Swadeshi vision of an autonomous national space and economy, and the attempt to actualize it on the terrain of everyday practices carried a utopian surplus yet unwritten by a distinctively territorial nativist episteme. The movement also endangered and sharpened differentiations of its own. We cannot focus on the utopian drift of Swadeshi imaginaries without a simultaneous account of the way in which it held Muslim hostage Muslims hostage as Muhammad Ali born to a historicist reading of the past, nor can we ignore the violent tensions that continue to haunt institutional nationalism long after the formal end of the Swadeshi movement. The contemporary Hindu nationalist project has redrawn every day in institutional landscapes, normative origins, and political discourse. It has reworked the nationalized educational curriculum, especially history in textbooks, along the thin, brutal lines of Hindutva, which not only pushes the obsessive archaism of early nationalist historiography to an absurd extreme, but seeks to erase that what even Raja Shiva Prasad insisted on in the early 1870s as the difference between poetic religious time and concrete historicity. Such pedagogical projects appear guaranteed to generate new nativist and historicist ideologies as common sense. What is more, we are increasingly witness to the proliferation of both state and popular violence towards Muslims who are seen as lacking a presumed organic connection to the national whole and made to collectively bear the burden of the presumed original sin of partition. The form and the level of violence in recent years, from Ayodhya to Bombay to Gujarat, seem to signal a departure from the simple marginalization toward the active exteriorization in both political and symbolic terms of the Indian Muslim population. They have certainly prompted a visceral recognition of the active visceral 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 recognition of the active presence of the 1947 partition, the blood-soaked materialization of national space that yielded the sovereign states of India and Pakistan in everyday political landscapes and discourses. Many of these developments have been fashioned by institutional logics and political shifts in the last few decades, yet they also represent brutal actualization of the embedded contradictions of territorial nativist conceptions of India as a bounded national space and economy as first forged during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The uncanny presence of ideologies and projects and subjectivities that belong as much to a supposedly superseded past as to the present should provide the impetus and occasion for a focus on the actually existing contradictions of National form and stronger run relationship to the dynamic and uneven historical geography of capital. Critical historical and political practice hinge on the identification of those elements in the present and or the oppressed possibilities and hopes of apparently past struggles that contains the potential of mediating between actual and the possible. We need to hit the spirit, not although 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 not the nationalist impulse of Bipin Pal's ex- exhortation to attend the uh, to attend to the actualities of the present. Only then can we begin to fashion genuinely critical projects that are not rooted in the ideology of the nation form nativist and organist visions of community or particularizing frameworks that we are uncomfortably close to the politics of closure that Hinduism seeks to actualize, moving beyond the multiple guises of methodological nationalism, emergence, and initial step towards these larger efforts. Larger effort. धन्यवाद. Thank you so much.